I'm Kimberly Crenshaw, Executive Director of the African American Policy Forum. And together with the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies, we welcome you to part 4 of our weekly webinar, Under the Blacklight, the Intersectional Vulnerabilities that COVID lays bare. Today, we're talking about disaster white supremacy, the opportunities that exist for racist projects to find fertile soil in the ruins of massive social disruption. On Under the Blacklight, we've been mining the roots of inequality that lead to the disproportionate impact that we're now witnessing. It's no accident, for example, that Black, Brown, and Native people are being impacted by the disease at substantially higher rates, and that workers, disproportionately people of color, are being told that they're essential and treated as though they are expendable. This is history, rinsed and repeated. Today, we want to look behind these patterns to specifically name and engage a pre-existing condition of its possibility, white supremacy. We're not just looking back, but we're also looking forward, borrowing here from the model that Naomi Klein, a previous guest on Under the Blacklight, calls disaster capitalism, to specifically explore this as a moment of disaster white supremacy. This white supremacy, as you'll see over the course of today's webinar, is unleashed by the uncertainty accompanying society-wide panic. As we'll discuss this week and next, responses to disasters have not typically disrupted status quos of racism, patriarchy, and market dogmatism, but instead have often served as an opportunity for their entrenchment. It's the job of those of us interested in a more just society to know this history in order to combat the cynical opportunism that we see unfolding today. That's why today I'm so excited to bring in 5 illustrious panelists to break down these tragic times. We'll start in our first segment of the night by hearing from Paul Butler, critically acclaimed author of Chokehold, Policing Black Men, and Let's Get Free, a hip-hop theory of justice. He's also professor of law at Georgetown University, and you've seen him as a frequent commentator on MSNBC. We're also joined by Bree Newsome-Bass, artist and community organizer. You know Bree as the person who actually spearheaded taking down the Confederate flag. So we're anxious to hear what her take on the current moment is. And finally, in our first section, we will be hearing from Barbara Arnwine, veteran voting rights advocate and president and founder of the Transformative Justice Coalition. You know her from the Map of Shame, which she will talk about shortly. We'll then take a quick break to check in on the conversation happening out there in the virtual universe. And then when we come back, we'll hear from Kehinde Andrews, academic, activist, and professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University, and Jonathan Metzl, author of Dying of Whiteness, professor and director of the Center for Medicine, Health, and Society at Vanderbilt University. Throughout this social justice SOS event, we want to hear from you. So please share your thoughts in the Zoom chat or tweet us at AA Policy Forum. Please expand the conversation across social media by following AAPF on Twitter and Facebook and using the hashtags Social Justice SOS and AAPF COVID. You can send comments and questions to our panelists through the Zoom platform. We'll be sharing them with our panelists throughout the event. This week, we're also offering a new feature to give you the opportunity to talk to us after the show. So stay tuned after the discussion to hear more. So let's dive right in with Paul Butler. So, Paul, you have been studying how policing and mass incarceration have historically offered opportunities to enforce systems of white supremacy. So I wonder if you would share some of the snapshots from the scene of the interaction between COVID, racialized policing, and mass incarceration in the US. So, Paul?
The first snapshot is of my hometown, Chicago, and it's 1918. 1918 is different from every year from 1990, from 1900 to 1999. 1918 is different because that's the only year that African Americans didn't disproportionately die of the flu. And the reason that's amazing is because that's the same year of the Spanish flu epidemic. The Spanish flu proportionally killed more white people than African Americans. And I don't have data about people who were neither African American or white. But unique among years, fewer Blacks proportionally died of the Spanish flu. Well, why is that? Well, you know, they tried to blame our bodies. They said it was our, I want to pronounce this right, so I'm going to look it up, our nail pharynx. They said it had to do with the thickness of our noses. And we know that's ridiculous because if that were the explanation, why would African Americans disproportionately die of respiratory illnesses other times? They tried to blame the Great Migration. Again, white supremacy has its own logic. The answer is always to blame Black people. The solution is always to blame people of color. And even though at the time it was known that African Americans were less likely to die of the disease, they still tried to blame us for bringing it. They blamed the Great Migration. The Chicago Tribune, July, it had a headline: Negroes swarm to the north. And that's what brought this disease. And so again, we see this same dynamic of blaming Black people and using the power of the state. And we see the same move by Black people. We have this subordination and we meet it with resistance. And ultimately that resistance is crushed. And so one explanation for why Blacks were less likely to get the Spanish flu is because there were two forms of it, two versions. There was the less mild version in the spring of 1918, and there was the more lethal version in the fall. And the theory is, for the reasons we all could imagine, that Blacks were more likely to get it in the spring when it was less lethal. And so by the time the deadly version came along in the fall, many Blacks had developed resistance, had developed immunity. And of course, we also see the power of the state. Again, no matter what the problem, to use the problem as an excuse. So African Americans often couldn't afford private doctors. Of course, some Black people still got the flu, even the deadly flu that fall. What the city of Chicago did was to deputize nurses, to give them police authority to enter people's homes to see if they had the flu, even without their will. So that's Chicago, that's 1918. The quick fast forward, we can stay in Chicago for a moment. We can go to the Cook County Jail. When I talk about abolition, I make the point that many people who are in prison are mentally ill. About 80% are either mentally ill or addicts. And so I say in that talk, and this Cook County City Jail is the largest jail, so it's actually the largest provider of mental health services, except it doesn't actually provide those services. Now the Cook County Jail represents one of the largest clusters of the coronavirus in the country. It should be one of the largest providers of services, but it is not providing those services. It cannot provide those services. And the people who are in there are essentially sentenced to death. And the other snapshot is of a public transportation, a bus in Philly, and a Black man is violently removed from the bus because he's not wearing a mask. Contrast that with Nashville, where two Black men are in a Walmart and the police officer forcibly removes them because they are wearing masks.
Mm. Wow. So thank you, Paul, for that snapshot, and we'll circle back around in a moment. But I just want to, sit for a moment with the idea that I think we're seeing unfolding policing practices being expressed in ways that are contradictory. In some places, we just saw a physician in Florida who was handcuffed, I guess because he was out, because what he was doing was misinterpreted. So there's going to be the policing of Black bodies for not doing what we're supposed to do, and the policing of Black bodies for doing what we're supposed to be doing. So, it gives us, of course, pause in the way that we all are fully aware of. I'm going to move for another snapshot to Bree. So Bree, you're in Raleigh, North Carolina. And I want to ask you to describe the scene for us there. What in particular is drawing your attention as COVID marches through dispossessed communities there?
Well, I think in my view as an organizer, and I think certainly in the views of people who are, living in dispossessed communities, is that we were in a crisis situation before the COVID outbreak, right? And that's because the status quo, or what, a lot of people identify as normal when they are calling for us to, get back to normal or reopen the country, which has become the other buzzword, the normal times were a disaster, right? And so I think that's really important to understand. And it is that disastrous status quo that laid the groundwork for COVID-19 outbreak in the United States to be so much worse than a lot of what we are seeing in other places around the world. So the lack of access to housing. I mean, we had a housing crisis going on in North Carolina, as of course is we're seeing across the country, where people are working full-time jobs in some cases and still can't afford to find safe, stable, consistent place to live. We have people who are working 2 jobs and still don't have access to affordable health care, right? So those are all of the things that are already baked into our infrastructure, that then when we have what is a public health crisis, because our system is so organized fundamentally around white supremacy and around the workforce that is now being labeled essential, who in fact are always have been essential workers, is not able to make a pivot to a public health response, right? So the status quo is exactly what Paul was speaking to. It's policing and prisons and violence. And so then when we have an outbreak, instead of the response being, how do we make sure that everyone who needs to shelter in place can shelter in place, instead of making sure that everyone who needs a mask has a mask, a lot of the focus is going back to maintaining a status quo of racial violence. And that status quo has always treated essential workers as disposable. And I mean, I think that is very important to recognize, even from the earliest days of the slave colonies. Slaves were both an essential labor force and were also highly disposable, because the dehumanization of that labor force is an essential part of how the whole economy is maintained. This economy that people are eager to get back to, this economy that is consistently prioritized above human life.
So you mentioned, Bree, the housing crisis as one point of inflection. How is the housing crisis actually being, how is it being manifest in the way COVID enforcement is playing out in Raleigh?
So I think it's so important for people to understand that a significant segment of our population, including myself at one point, are caught in a cycle of housing instability. So a lot of times people think homeless means, strictly I'm sleeping on a park bench, or, I have absolutely nowhere to go tonight, right? The reality is that there are some people who are in that position, but a lot of people are just caught in a cycle where maybe they can make rent this month, but not next month. And we know that's hitting a lot of people, a lot more people now. So we had, prior to the COVID outbreak, people who were caught in that cycle. And now we have people who maybe, before the outbreak, were kind of in a stable situation, and now they're falling into the cycle of housing instability. So here in North Carolina, we have a situation where we had to, first of all, push the governor to put, a stay in place order, statewide in place. But even once that is in place, that doesn't mean everyone has a place to go. And people who do have a place to go, doesn't mean that they can afford the rent to stay there, right? And it just highlights what housing advocates like myself have been saying for a long time, which is that housing is a fundamental public health issue. And it's actually square one in terms of having health and stability. And when we have a system that is so organized around inequality and ensuring, like by design, to guarantee that people are unequal in their outcomes, and that where you live kind of determines your health and longevity, what we find is that it lowers the quality of life for everyone in this society. And the outbreak is showing what was always true, that the health and well-being of one person impacts the entire public health.
Yes, yes. And I guess to put a point on it, what does stay in place mean when you don't have a place that you can consistently stay in? And oddly enough, that doesn't seem to arrest the tendency of police and officials from actually punishing those people who don't have a consistent place to stay. That's one of the more shocking dimensions of how policing in this moment is playing out. So let's go to another ongoing crisis, and one that's nearing its ultimate test, the crises of voter suppression. So for some thoughts on this, I want to turn to my friend Barbara Arnwine. So Barbara, you've long fought to enhance democratic participation here in the US. And I suppose it would stand to reason, given US claims to being a democracy, that the last thing that would be on the chopping block during a crisis would be democracy itself. But what we saw in Wisconsin last week might suggest otherwise. So can you take us to the scene of that crime and help us understand what happened there?
It was a continuation of a crime that started, ages ago, centuries ago, of voter suppression, but the modern era of voter suppression started in 2011. And what we saw on April the 7th was virus voting. Now, who would have ever
virus voting?
Virus voting. Who would have ever thought that we would see a state so desperate? The GOP, and I'm just saying who did it, was so desperate to have a conservative member of the court win, they thought, if they could suppress the vote. So the governor said, listen, we got to cancel this election. We only have 5 voting places in Milwaukee. We normally have 160. We wanted to have at least 26, but we can't staff it. It's too dangerous. So we're going to cancel the election. We're going to postpone it until a safer date. The GOP of his state takes him to court, to the Supreme Court, the same Supreme Court that wants to keep itself a conservative court. So they ruled that no, the governor's wrong. He doesn't have the authority, and they're going to block him, and blocked him from canceling the election. At the same time, they weren't happy to only use one Supreme Court. They went to the United States Supreme Court to block a lower federal court decision that had said, listen, the state of Wisconsin didn't send people their absentee ballots. Thousands upon thousands of people got nothing nothing to vote with, or they could not get it in the mail in time for it to be counted. So the judge said, I'm going to give them 6 extra days. The United States Supreme Court says, oh no, that's going too far. Oh, we can't do that. That's violating the Purcell rules, changing the policies too close to the election. Come on, please. And since the election, we have all seen the pictures of the bins of unmailed ballots, thousands of people whose ballots were being put. So virtually what they were saying was either you stay home and lose your vote, or you go vote and possibly lose your life. So
which is an equation from our history, right? Vote or your life.
Listen, Okechee, Florida, where they killed 56 African Americans for voting, in the early 1900s. Listen, this is a continuum, but here they were so determined that they're willing to risk everybody's life. And guess what? It backfired.
Yeah, how did it backfire?
Oh, honey, it backfired because people said, this is what you're gonna do to us? You think this is the way you're gonna win? You think you're gonna scare us into losing our vote? People got out there and they voted like crazy. In fact, it was the largest turnout for a primary that Wisconsin has seen in decades. People were so angry. They were like, people hate voter suppression. They know that it's cheating. Voter suppression essentially in its essence is cheating. It is, using your power, your political power to block the people in the electorate who you don't like, who you don't think are going to vote the way you want on the vote, or are not going to vote to keep you in power. So you tip and you rig the scales so that those people can't participate. So the ideal for voter suppressors coming into this year was, we're just going to shrink the electorate. And they tried to do it in Wisconsin, and people said, oh, well, they said no. I was going to say something else. And they turned out and they voted. And guess what? Not only did they vote in a new member to the court and vote out the conservative member, they also passed a new initiative that will stop the gerrymandering. Remember, Wisconsin is one of the most partisan gerrymander states in the nation. So they passed an initiative saying that's over too. We're gonna put that back into the hands of the people and not into a partisan legislature. So tell me about it. If you think you're gonna stop us, don't forget that when we vote, we win.
Yes. Well, Wisconsin holds a special place in my heart, and the Supreme Court does as well. It's where I clerked for Justice Shirley Abramson. So I was delighted to see that this transformational moment has happened in Wisconsin. So I want to thank everybody for getting us started, and we'll move shortly to our next segment. I'm going to ask Janine Irving, AAPF Social Media Director, to give us a brief rundown about what we've been hearing online so far. Janine?
Well, good evening to everyone. I hope that we are enjoying our 4th webinar in the series. We've got a lot of great conversation going on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Just making sure. So I'm going to give you a couple of great comments from @Aaron Manolo from Twitter. Wear a mask, get forcibly removed. Don't wear a mask, get forcibly removed. Either way, Black men are policed for their behavior. Another great comment, housing from based on what Bree was saying, is a fundamental health issue. And if there's a stay in place policy, what do people without a place to live do? Also some wonderful conversations going on in the Zoom chat. We've got some comments from Jason Wu, a wonderful participant from each of our webinars, saying absolutely, we have to be very cautious and critical of how the law is used to enforce social distancing. Criminalization is dangerous, is a dangerous move by the state. And from Alexandra Oprea, our fallback seems to always be getting police involved, criminalizing, etc. And we know who's going to bear the brunt of that. So again, wonderful conversations. Please keep dropping your comments in so we can get to them. They are all appreciated.
Thank you, Janine. So in our first segment, we were giving you some snapshots from the ground to clearly invoke what's happening in real time. And we want to build out from those snapshots to get a sense of how these things are playing out elsewhere, and then explore the historical, political, and policy context. We are calling these the conditions of inequalities possibility. So I want to start by hearing from Kai Andrews. He's the author of Back to Black, Retelling Black Radicalism for the 21st Century, and a fellow critical race theorist. Kai, so we got a better sense now about what's been happening here, but across the pond, as we like to say, you all in Britain are experiencing some of the same dynamics, particularly with respect to your leader, who in many respects resembles our own. So he too was reckless, and unlike our own leader, he paid the price. So it may be that in large part because he didn't take the disease seriously, thousands of others will suffer. Now, we can assume that utter stupidity plays a role in this. But beyond that, I wonder how you think whiteness played a role in his initial denial of a threat.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that we have in common with the special relationship is Trump and Johnson. In fact, my 7-year-old son has very difficulty telling them apart. Basically thinks they're the same person. And if you think about why we have two highly mediocre white men running two of the biggest economies in the world, you can only really explain this through whiteness, right? Like whiteness is what puts them in the position to be making these terrible decisions in the first place. And it's also whiteness which then kind of brings on these terrible decisions. I think one of the things we really look at the UK and America is that we're quite the same, far more the same in our way that our politics is, in the way that our neoliberalism is, than other parts of Europe, which is also one of the reasons why you're seeing a very similar trajectory to the disease. Britain will probably end up with the most deaths in Europe. America is probably going to end up with the most deaths in the world. This isn't a surprise. It shouldn't really be a surprise given how the countries are run and who they're run by. So if you look at Boris Johnson, his appeal, why he's prime minister, again, very similar to Trump. So Trump is on that Make America Great. And we had a whole campaign to leave the European Union, which is kind of based on this Little England mentality, make Britain great again, anti-immigrant, very neoliberal, talking about special relationship with the United States. So that's why he's even in power in the first place. And again, highly mediocre, not very competent, and showing this in the first place. So his stupidity is part of whiteness. The fact that you can have stupid people running countries is whiteness, right? I've been a big critic of Barack Obama, I think I'd say, but to be black, you have to be exceptional to be in these roles. To be white, you can be highly mediocre and even less than mediocre to be in these roles. So whiteness is the condition which puts them in place.
And I wonder if it makes sense to also, and I'm glad you said that about, Barack Obama. I tweeted yesterday, imagine all of this stuff had happened under Barack Obama's watch. And in addition to not taking responsibility for it, he actually then goes on to say, I am the authority here. What I say goes. It's just, one can't imagine that could have happened and he still would have had, approval. I read that Boris Johnson, for example, to go back to your side of the pond, his recent approval numbers are at 61%.
Yeah, and this is.
So I'm trying to figure out, how do you understand that?
And we think about it, this is why I say whiteness is it's a psychosis. There's no rational way to understand it. I mean, this is a man who, at the start, doesn't take it seriously in the first place. At one point, every European country is under lockdown, apart from the United Kingdom. At this point, they're talking about herd immunity, the fact that everybody just catches it, we'll all get over it. They seem to miss the point that would have meant 500,000 deaths in the UK. He actually caught the disease probably when he was in a COVID ward, shaking hands with patients, and came out bragging on TV afterwards. I mean, this is the most incompetent person ever, but he's literally caught the disease, has led to, we're in the middle of a big wave now of deaths. But had we shut down the country a week earlier, as was pretty obvious we should have done, this never would have happened. But because of the way that whiteness works, because we're now in a siege mentality, using the war metaphors, he's overcome the disease, he's our leader, people are rallying around him. You can't really explain that other than whiteness. Because if he was black, he wouldn't be prime minister. But if he was a black prime minister, there's absolutely no way.
No rallying around. Yeah.
Yeah, no way, not at all.
And I'm sure we're going to get into this a little bit more, but just to manage the conversation, it's important to distinguish when we're talking about whiteness. We're not necessarily talking about every white person. We're talking about an ideology. We're talking about a set of beliefs, a set of behaviors that go along with those beliefs. Many of those behaviors obviously impact the well-being of non-white people, but also many of those behaviors impact the well-being of white people. So for that, I want to turn to Jonathan and ask, what you've been seeing. I mean, you've been spending the last 5 years studying how a politics of white supremacy becomes lethal for communities of color and for poor white communities as well. So what were you seeing and hearing when the pandemic first started? And what are you seeing now that amplifies some of the findings in your book, Dying of Whiteness?
Well, first, let me just say how honored I am to be here. And I hope one day very soon, all 677 of us can hang out in person and stand closer than 6 feet to each other. But I'm really glad for this forum, because I think in a way what I'm seeing is kind of my research on steroids. I'll say that, first of all, when the pandemic first hit, I think there was a moment of terror across the country. All of a sudden, people realized that they were vulnerable in ways that they hadn't experienced before. Not that everybody was vulnerable in the same way, but all of a sudden, here's a virus that, at least in its initial phase, people thought it doesn't care if you're rich or poor, if you're in a red state or a blue state, who you are. Here's this virus that is lethal in a way. And so in the beginning, there were all of these, for example, op-eds in places like Politico and the Washington Post, and people were saying, what's going to be the outcome of this moment of pandemic? And I think there was a lot of hope that basically people were saying, we're going to realize that we need to strengthen our healthcare system. We're going to realize that we need to lift up people, because if you just think about how the virus itself works, nobody's safe until everybody's safe. So we can't really have reservoirs of this particular virus. And so in a particular way, it was a moment where it was like, here's a structural problem, let's fix the structural problem. And now I just wrote this book, Dying of Whiteness. I spent 5 years basically studying, I think you're right what you were saying. It's not that every white person is racist, but that there are structural ideologies that tell particularly working class white people that they're in a zero-sum formulation, that if they don't hold on to their privilege, that immigrants and minorities are going to come usurp those resources. And that has led to what I see as, I think it's either psychotic, as Kai was just saying, or suicidal kinds of approaches to things like healthcare and guns and other factors. And what I saw in my research when I was writing the book is basically that the kind of standard white stance on healthcare, on guns, ended up being terrible for communities of color, but it also ended up killing a lot of white people. And so when the coronavirus started to hit, all of a sudden, what I saw was the exact same policies that I had been studying. Two examples. First of all, the coronavirus was a perfect example where we could have gone in and expanded Medicaid, get everybody under the umbrella of healthcare. But because Trump jumped in and basically said, no Obamacare, all these kind of things, all these states that were already at risk are now not going to have healthcare. And it ties into a lot of historical stuff that I look at in my book about kind of the history of white Americans being afraid of being in a network with other kinds of people. It's the same thing with guns. Why are guns essential businesses? All these white Americans rushed out and bought guns. And it turns out that the gun issue is another example where this construction of whiteness, this armed white man who needs to have a gun, well, it might make them feel self-protected, but it turns out most gun deaths in this country are actually white male suicides. And so all these men running out and getting guns is going to put their own families, their own bodies at risk, also domestic violence. And so all of the studies that I've done in my research that were just these state level analyses became these national policies. And in a way, it's clearly this formulation of whiteness has led us down the wrong path. And I think ultimately what we're going to see is that this pandemic is a medical problem, it's a social problem, but ultimately in the United States right now, the pandemic is a whiteness problem.
Mhm. So I wonder if you would think a little bit more with us about the implications of what you just said, right? That it's a whiteness problem. With this in mind, many of us who are on this call, who've been doing this work, you know, we're part of progressive communities. We've been engaged in politics for a long time. In that space, there is this sort of common, you know, rehearsed idea that all we need is to come together to see our common interests, to have a common narrative of the thing that is undermining our well-being, the thing that's coming, you know, to get us. For white people in particular to see that there is something that threatens us all, you know, greater than the thing that, you know, separates us. So for forever, this has sort of been the panacea that we've been looking for to erase, you know, to create more racial solidarity, to, you know, advocate for healthcare, advocate against, you know, global degradation. We could go on and on. So one couldn't think of a better example of the thing that's gonna get us all than COVID, right? And yet, there is not this moment of, okay, I'm going to throw down this racial stuff and come together, even though it might well be that not doing so may threaten your life. So what do we do with that now?
You know, I'll say a couple of actually optimistic things. I think there are examples in the pre-COVID period of political campaigns that have been run based on kind of a different formulation of common interests. I'm not saying like white lives matter or something, but I would urge people to look, for example, at the Kentucky gubernatorial election that happened last year, where basically there was a Republican who was, you know, supported by Trump and all these things, and then a Democrat who came in and basically just said, here's how we can all do better. I'm going to give you guys healthcare. I'm going to give you guys all these things. Bring back the Medicaid expansion. Louisiana, a similar gubernatorial race where a Democrat won simply by talking to people about common interests. And so I think that there are political examples in our recent history of political alliances around common interests. And hopefully that will emerge. Unfortunately, right now, Trump has the bullhorn. He's the only, it's like Home Alone on Home Alone 10 million or whatever. He's the only guy in Washington, D.C. right now. He's got this whole pulpit and he's just feeding people all this anxiety narrative. And it's really about kind of how are we going to get the word out? But I do think that there are examples of alliance building. I think Wisconsin is another good example. It's really about getting the word out right now, because I'll just say in my research, I met a lot of people who were very problematically racist. And if people read the book, they can see those examples. But I also met people who felt like they were just trapped in the system and didn't have another particular alternative. And so I'm still somewhat hopeful that as the virus writes the narrative, that we find some kind of common humanity. But I will also say that everything that the Trump administration has been doing right now is not just in its commercial financial self-interest. It's also to block the kind of alliances that people need to have to say, gosh, who cares what our political party or our background is? We all benefit if we stop this virus together. So I think it's important to note that how many of Trump's actions have been blocking those kinds of alliances, the kind of alliances that, you know, have been blocked. You know, Du Bois wrote about this as the kind of wage of whiteness. We're seeing a kind of wage of whiteness strategy right now to not let people come together in common cause.
Right. Well, so we have a lot of food for discussion here, but before we move to our roundtable discussion, I want to check back in with the conversation online and listen to some of the questions that have come up for you. So coming back to you, Janine.
Yes. So again, conversation is energized right now. People really latched on to voting virus. This was something that's probably can be used throughout this year based on everything that we're going through. So one of the Twitter comments, voter suppression is a prime example of political power to disenfranchise those you don't like. Your success in passing anti-gerrymandering initiatives and a better Supreme Court judge. That came from Pat Shelley, SSW. Another Twitter comment is, There's mediocrity inherent in whiteness in leadership roles. If you're Black, you must be exceptional. If you're white, you need only be mediocre. That's a facet of white supremacy. This country is dying of whiteness, and that came from Angela M. Novak. Couple of comments from the Zoom chat. From Kapil Chowsky, hope I didn't ruin that name. Historically, elites in many societies have used immigrants as bogeymen and created artificial conflict between immigrants and historically marginalized non-immigrant people, which is absolutely true. Another comment from Carla Bailey Cooper is, if Black people lined up at gun stores, we'd probably have a number of them arrested or killed. That's where I think the state of race understandings and relationships is in the US. And it's sad. So yeah, great conversation. Everyone, please keep adding your questions and your comments, and we'll hopefully get some of them taken care of in the panelists in the next part.
All right, thanks, Janine. Rich conversation going on. So let's dive a little deeper into the historical and political backdrop of many of the observations that you all are bringing, also with an idea toward examining what is being enhanced in this moment. Not so much in terms of our resistance, that I want to talk about in a moment, but the use of this crisis moment to actually expand the reach of projects that were going forward before. And some of this conversation is about what we might have missed. Largely, it seems as though one of the reasons that disaster oppression happens is that people are distracted by just survival. They are distracted by the crises, and that becomes this opportunity for many of these things to happen. This is very much part of how Naomi Klein talks about what happened in New Orleans, the elimination of public schools, public housing, the elimination of Black people, something that could happen in the context of a crisis. So now thinking far more in a targeted way about other examples like this, I'm really curious. I'm going to come to you, Barbara Arnwine. So you point out that voting suppression has been going on, for a while. It's not necessarily new. We saw the extent to which voting repression could express itself, even to the point of actually making people choose between their life and the franchise. So there is something profound about those pictures, but also it's a continuation. But I'm interested in how little traction voting suppression got, say, in the presidential debates for the Democratic nomination. I mean, it only came up maybe twice, and even then it was kind of controversial. So could you speak a little bit to this failure on the progressive side of the aisle about the need to fight tooth and nail around the suppression of voting? Why has it been so hard to actually make this the priority that it needs to be, even among allies in the progressives side of the aisle?
Well, are they allies? I mean, somehow, if you don't have a racial politic that is progressive, then you can't call yourself a progressive just because you have an economic outlook that might be different than anti-rich, and it's much more populist in nature. But if you don't have a racial baseline, if you don't really have a racial justice baseline, then you really have issues. So I say, part of it is that constantly what I have encountered since 2000 has been a whole politic around, don't talk about race. Don't, if we do that, then we're playing the race card, and white voters are going to be turned off. That's been the entire, mentality. And when I came out with the map of shame in 2011, people told me to hush, to shut up. They didn't want to hear
just give us a sense of what the map of shame was doing. What were you doing with this map?
Well, what people missed was that in 2010, 25 million people who voted in 2008 did not vote in the midterm election because some people just only vote presidential, which is a problem. But in any event, because of those 25 million not voting, 30 state legislatures became very much consolidated as conservative state legislatures. And what happened was on January 1st, they started introducing emergency legislation. The purpose of that legislation was to introduce voting restrictive laws, voter restrictive laws, voter suppression laws. From January 1 to April 1st, 40 states had over 100 pending voter suppression bills. That's how effective they were. That's how fast they were, how targeted they were, how determined they were.
And so your map was designed to show how this was marching across the country.
Right, because nobody wanted to believe it. Everybody wanted to say, hey, we got a Black president. This can't be happening. The Obama coalition is forever. No, they said, listen, we understand that democracy is about, the governance of the people. We don't like the demographics that are coming out. We don't like that coalition. We're going to kill it. And how we're going to kill it is by coming up with these cheating plans called voter suppression laws. So that's how you got the cuts to early voting. That's how you got the elimination of same-day voter registration in states. That's how you got the end of Souls to the Polls Sundays, where people would go and vote right after church to get cars, some assistance to drive to the polls. That's how you got the end of 16, pre-registering people from 16, 17 before they turned 18. That's how you ended up with all of these ugly, vicious voter ID laws. That's how you ended up with all of these evil practices designed to shrink the electorate, designed to cut people out, and not to mention, in the last 3 years, what have we seen? 18 million people purged from the voting rolls.
And at the same time, just to double back on where we started, there is not much conversation about this, not nearly as much as there needs to be. And let's just say, it predates, this particular moment. There wasn't a lot of conversation about it, during the last Democratic administration, not a lot of conversation about it leading, into the election that gave us 45. And now I think in some ways those chickens have come home to roost. Among the other opportunistic diseases that this moment creates is the disease of enhanced policing. So Paul, I want to come back to you and ask you quickly to just give us snapshots of two different things. Quick snapshot of so now there are efforts underway to address the fact that, those bodies that are most at risk right now are those who are, in custody, in our prisons, in our jails. And of course, those are disproportionately Black and brown people, disproportionately poor people. So what is afoot right now to address that crisis?
So white supremacy is crafty. It anticipates and adapts to our resistance. And so earlier when we thought about the stay-at-home orders and how they might impact the homeless, in the District of Columbia, the stay-at-home order specifically exempts the homeless. But it's let them eat cake because it does not provide them with housing. And similarly, in the policing context, right now, police have an extraordinary, unprecedented amount of power based on these shelter-in-place orders. In the District of Columbia, if a police officer sees a group of Black men playing basketball, he can literally arrest them. They're subject to 70 days in prison and up to a $5,000 fine. In communities of color in New Jersey, the police are conducting roadblocks simply to stop cars and ask, why are you out? Now again, with the craftiness of white supremacy, its law has anticipated our objections. And what police departments are telling their officers is, don't make arrests just because you can. You need to limit arrests for your safety. You need to limit that contact, and also for the safety of the public. And what we're seeing so far is, in fact, arrests are going down. That is good news. If we look at what happens in other countries, though, that are somewhat ahead of us in terms of their timeline on the virus, what happens is that people get fed up with the shelter in place, and cops get fed up with not using all of their power. So in Spain, 31,000 people have been cited for violating the stay-at-home orders. In France, 100,000 new officers on the streets just to enforce those orders. In Kenya, people have been killed for violating the state curfew, killed by the police. An African-American person might look at this and say, I've seen this movie before, and I know how it's going to end. And last thing is, when we talk about the adaptability and the exploiting of opportunities, I want us to think about a man who's been a great contrast to President Trump. I want us to think about the daily briefings of Governor Cuomo, where he inspires a tremendous amount of confidence, at least in his leadership and his concern, again, in contrast to the President of the United States. New York passed a far-sweeping bail reform bill in January 1st, eliminated bail, cash bail, in 90% of arrests. The cop union didn't like that law. Some prosecutors didn't like that law. They appealed to Governor Cuomo. Governor Cuomo had a budget bill coming up, and he decided he was going to go along with what those cop unions and what those other folks were saying. And he was going to restore bail for 13 different crimes. And that was going to be in this budget bill. White supremacy is crafty, and it adapts. When people protested, Governor, how can you do this? The governor responded, look, this bill has to be signed tomorrow. This is a couple of weeks ago. He said, this bill has to be signed tomorrow. We could hold it up and try to address your issue, but that also means that public health won't be funded. So I guess, Kim, the last thing is that people are watching movies, a lot of documentaries and Netflix. There's an amazing documentary about an episode in Philadelphia where the police department bombed the home that activists, African-American activists, were living in, trying to get them out of the home. They wouldn't leave voluntarily. It bombed the home with many women, men, and children in the home. There was a question about whether the cops knew the home was actually occupied at that time. During the event, an officer was notified, a high up ranking officer was notified what was going on. And there were people in the house, and the house was on fire. The name of the documentary is what the officer said. The officer said, let the fire burn. When Governor Cuomo, when other state lawmakers allow people who don't need to be in jail to remain in jail and prison during this pandemic, they are saying, let the fire burn. Let the pandemic kill those people, because that is what will happen.
I'm so glad you raised that for us, Paul, because, partly, because of what's that saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. There is this rush to embrace the governor of New York because he isn't as, I don't even want to say, he's not as out there as our president, yet when he doubles down on precisely the policies that put so many people at risk of this, and especially, I think it's important to re-emphasize, a lot of people who are locked up are locked up because they couldn't afford to pay. Couldn't afford to either pay for bail, couldn't afford to pay for a good defense, couldn't run the risk of a full trial. So you can't be on one hand, the hero, and on the other hand, double down on locking up people, knowing that what is in fact a range of economic circumstances that put so many people there turns into death sentence. At least those two things have to be held in conversation with one another. On that note, Bree, I want to go to you in your work. What are you seeing? What are you thinking people should be on the lookout for that builds out from this moment? Things that are happening that bear the fingerprints of white supremacy in the past that are now being projected forward through this COVID crisis moment.
Well, in my view, I think the status quo, not only is it a disaster, it's also unsustainable. And again, this is something else that we have known for a long time. It is incompatible with humanity and, with human dignity and human rights. It is incompatible with democracy, as, much as we claim to be a democracy in the United States, we know that is not true. And we know that that has been an inherent conflict from the beginning because systems of slavery and dehumanization cannot coexist with any, true system of human rights and democracy. So I think we are at a point where the system, certainly the economy, if we wanted to define the system around the economy, as I often do, the system of white capitalism is in free fall. It's in collapse. We had a situation where people have been asking for a bailout, for a rescue for quite some time. We have to remember there's a significant segment of our population who has still not recovered from the last recession, right? Just 10 years ago. And so now we are at a situation where a lot of the proposed solutions that are coming forward are not solutions. Those were kind of like Band-Aids that may have been effective before the COVID-19. I'm thinking of things like, a $1,200 stimulus check for people. Right. People needed that before the outbreak. Like I said, people were already struggling to make ends meet. So what we really need now is fundamental structural change. The systems, the infrastructure, in both tangible and intangible ways, not only just like the culture and the ideas of, colonialism and white supremacy that are dangerous, but just the literal infrastructure. The way that our school systems are designed, the way that our neighborhoods are designed, are not compatible with the future, and that is what COVID is exposing. And so that's why people like myself, we are demanding more fundamental change in this moment. We need universal health care. We needed that for a long time. There's no more kicking the can down the road on these issues. Healthcare should be a guarantee. Housing should be a guarantee. You should, if you work full time, your income should be enough for you to afford the things that you need in order to survive. Again, there's absolutely no justification for the United States of America being the wealthiest nation on the face of the earth, has the most resources, had the greatest amount of forewarning and time to prepare, and is having the worst outcome, right, in the world. That is a searing indictment of the status quo and of the structures, and people like myself who have been saying for some time, we can't get back to normal. There is no making America great again. There is no getting back to normal. There is no restoring the status quo. There is only coming into an awareness and making peace with how the status quo has been killing us, right? And now changing that structure in a fundamental way, and let's get about the business of actually having a human rights-based democracy.
Mm-hmm. So on the notion of what we have to do to create a human rights-based democracy, I want to go back to Kai, since basically, United States, the UK, they see themselves as partners in this, great process of, civilizing the planet. Yet, if we look to see what's going to happen, at least a civilization is measured in terms of its capacity to secure the health and well-being of its citizens. The UK and the United States are on track to get a big fat F. What is your sense of what has to be more fully brought forward, first of all, to diagnose why we are hand in hand in our incapacity to actually rise to this moment? And, you know, obviously, since we're talking about histories of imperialism, of colonialism, of genocide and slavery, it can't be an accident that we are side by side historically in our involvement in these as well. So how do we bring these forward to understand this contemporary moment?
Well, I think the key thing really, like the UK and the US are the leaders of neoliberalism. If you really look at like one of the things with this government and what it came into power on this kind of neoliberal promise, really, we're going to cut taxes, we're going to go with America rather than Europe in terms of regulations. Our much vaunted National Health Service, which is a universal system, was basically being offered up for sale. And one of the things that's happened here, which is really problematic, is this has now given the government an opportunity to clothe themselves in the NHS. So if you watch anything on TV, it's always NHS, National Health Service. Those three letters are always on TV. Do you see right there, protect the NHS? And this is kind of a branding of look how much we've supported this thing, which actually we're trying to totally destroy and dismantle and sell to America. And so I worry that actually what we'll have is this kind of temporary, really quite left-wing policies. If you look at the money they're spending, I mean, we're giving, I think, 80% of salary to everybody. It looks really great. It looks really left, but that hides the actual project. And the project in the UK is exactly the same project in the US. Also has exactly the same racial dimensions. So in the UK, you're far more likely to have the disease in hospital if you're a ethnic minority, far more likely to die. And if you look at the National Health Service, which is good in lots of ways, but is also a colonial project in many ways, and it has relied on Black and brown workers for the front line since it existed 70 years ago. And now you're seeing that about 75% of the deaths of NHS workers are people of color. And this should not surprise anybody given the history of the NHS. But as an example of how that the real structural things aren't being worked out in this country, there's basically no discussion of the fact that almost all the people who died in this NHS, and we're celebrating them, we're clapping them and outside at 8 o'clock in the night every day, but no one's mentioned the fact that almost all of them are Black and brown. So we haven't really come to terms with the structural problems in the same way that the US hasn't either.
Yeah, right. So, you know, some of what makes neoliberalism work as an ideology is the belief that the losers are those people over there, right? Not me, not my family, you know, but the immigrants, the Black people, the homeless. I mean, it's always somebody else. And you know, I'm wondering whether that is a predicate for even how people are thinking about the disease. You know, it's not going to hit me. You know, that's somebody else, right? And so I'm really, you know, when I look at Boris Johnson, I was like, what makes you think you can just go in and where are you getting this idea? You know what? And so you're doing something about psychosis. How do you blend that together for an analysis?
Well, yeah, if you think about it, I mean, one of the neoliberalism is kind of like the most advanced form of whiteness. And one of the things with whiteness is this kind of really strong individual and the supremacy of the individual and the white individual in particular. So it shouldn't be a surprise that the countries which are the most individualistic, the UK and the US, are going to be the ones which have the highest toll, because it is this. It's not going to affect me. It's not going to touch my life. It will be somebody else. Even so, some of the analysis I saw about why there are some people when they are looking at why it is ethnic minorities who are more likely to catch a disease and more likely to die, they're talking about let's look at genetics and let's look at the individual inside. And it's blatantly obvious. It's about poverty. It's about overcrowding. It's about all those things. Same thing is about this is a social problem. This is not an individual problem. But we are very much addressing this as an individual problem.
Yeah.
And all the metaphors we use here are war. Can you fight the disease? Boris Johnson's a great prime minister because he's so strong because he fought through coronavirus. And the other side of that argument is, well, if you didn't manage to make it, like
would have been
a nurse who died recently, a pregnant nurse who was working on the ward just a few weeks ago, just died. Actually, a black woman, young black woman. So what we're saying, she's not strong because she couldn't make it through the disease. It's the
Right.
worst way to understand it, and has huge
Yeah.
racial implications.
Yeah, and you know, the racial implications are puzzling to me, that they don't get articulated more in terms of what it tells us about whiteness. So I think a lot of us anticipate and can have the critique about, now that we're talking about disparity, the projection of a vulnerability as a biological predisposition. We can, you know, we see that for what it is, and we can critique that. But the inverse of it is more or less, and therefore we're immune, and therefore we're less likely, you know, to have this disease. And that's not really marked as much. You know, people really aren't talking about what it means when a finger gets pointed. There's four that come back that basically say, and therefore, you know, I'm pretty, you know, I don't have to worry about it. And it brings me back. I knew that I'd seen this movie, Jonathan, some time ago. It was a movie. We dug it out. It was with Harry Belafonte. It's called The Word, the Flesh, and the Devil. And there was a disaster, and there were 3 people left. I don't know 3 people left in the world, but there were 3 people left. And Harry Belafonte was the hero, and there was a white woman, and eventually a white man. And there was one point, I had never heard this phrase before, but because I was a kid, and it was like, you know, the white woman says something to assert her, you know, she'll be fine. And she says something like, because I'm free, white, and single. And I was like, it was the first time I'd heard whiteness deployed, you know, like that, as like a shield. And now that we're in a disaster again, and there's so many people, particularly in those red states, who seem to be acting like that, right? Like, you know, we can do all these things, and we don't need these orders, and we'll be fine. Is there a way in which whiteness is playing out as a protector, as a shield, as some kind of immunity to the terrible things that happen around the world to people of color?
Well, certainly, I think that that if there's an immunity, it's just the privilege of the system, right? And so, in that sense, I know I just keep thinking about what Kai was saying before, and I can't tell you how much I agree with it. That on one hand, the disease of whiteness in this moment is this idea of this kind of zero-sum thinking. I saw this in my own research before the pandemic, where I was interviewing people who were tremendously medically ill, very poor white people in red states, who wouldn't sign up for the Affordable Care Act. And I asked, well, why is that? And they said, well, I'm not signing up for a system, as a quote that somebody told me, that benefits Mexicans and welfare queens. This idea that basically, even if this system might benefit me, if it's going to bring in undeserving immigrants and minorities, I don't want to be a part of it. And so partially, there is this idea of a hierarchy, right? It really is going back to that idea of a wage of whiteness, this idea that even if we're relatively in the same poor state, in the same rough socioeconomic class, even though some people are obviously surveilled more than others, that in a way, there's something about being white that keeps me above other people. But I want to make an important point for this conversation, I think, which is also that just like racism is structural, so too is whiteness. There's not just a monolithic sense of whiteness. Not every white person has the same relationship to whiteness. And the reason I say that is because think about the people that I interviewed, or the people now who are living in red states and who are suffering from, you know, all the economic and medical issues as well. If red state Republicans started to say, yeah, we support Trump, but in exchange for our support, what we want health care. We actually want, you know, prescription drug plan. We want Medicaid expansion. We want access to roads and bridges and schools. If people basically said, in order for our support for GOP politics, we want a kind of progressive conservatism that meets our material needs. If they ever started to do that, if working class white people ever started to do that, the entire GOP platform would fall apart, because then the GOP wouldn't be able to do what it's doing right now, which is giving tax breaks to millionaires and corporations. They couldn't afford that if it actually had to pay for things that benefited its base. And so the strategy instead is to keep feeding working class white Americans this kind of red meat of other people are coming to get you, you know, rapists are coming across the border, or coronavirus is a Chinese virus, or all these kind of things. It's this steady diet, a kind of deflection that plays to all of these historical points. There's a history of racism in healthcare. There's a history of racism in guns and education. All the points that are being used now are they're like code words in a particular way, to deflect, to not get white people to basically say, yeah, we have common cause with other people. And so in a way, what we're seeing now is that kind of codification in overdrive, so that white Americans, working class white Americans, and I'm not trying to get them off the hook, right? I mean, is a lot of bias in accepting that. But I would also say that there's a lot of work from the superstructure, so that the base doesn't ask for you know, conditions that might better its own material conditions.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, we certainly have a sense that the society that we're inheriting after this is not the same that we went into, in the sense that, yes, many of the preconditions for this crisis were always there. And at the same time, there is no normal to come back to. So that is both a challenge. It's a crisis within a crisis and a challenge. So what I'm really hoping to hear is how you all think about what we need to be doing now to prepare for this post-COVID world, whatever that's gonna look like. What should be at the top of our agenda, because we don't want to wait to see what's going to happen. I think we can see the trajectory. So getting into formation now, what does that look like? So Barbara, I'm gonna come back to you, because obviously, you know, if we don't have a political strategy, if we don't have a way of actually translating our desires and preferences into political power, then we can have all the greatest plans and webinars in the world. It won't itself get us where we need to go. So what's your sense of what needs to be happening now?
Well, you know, we opened this year determined to defeat and fight voter suppression and to preserve our democracy. We had no idea that we would also have to be fighting, you know, virus voting. So what we're doing now is that we're organizing. We have a voter justice network that we have been organizing. It's brand new. If people want to join, if people really are looking for some good stuff to do, go to votingrightsalliance.org, votingrightsalliance.org, which is our organizing formation. And we are having Twitter storms every week, giving people information. But here's what I want everyone to do. Know that, one, your best friend is vote.org. It's headed by two powerful Black women. Vote.org. They put out information, but you can go on vote.org and you can register to vote. You can check your voter registration system, status. Because remember, I mentioned that 18 million who have been purged. Not one of those people got a notification saying they've been purged. They have no idea. They all think they're still registered. And they're going to be, really shocked and upset when they go to the polls and find out that they aren't. If you're sitting at home right now and you're not working, I know we're all working in some ways, we're at home, but if you have time, reach out to every person you think in your family who claim that they're registered and you know they're not, all your friends, all your colleagues, everybody, reach out to them and help them to register, because they can go to vote.org, rock the vote, and they can do that. People who are in states, there are 20-something plus states that have good absentee balloting laws. There are 19 that are horrible, and you got to know it. And if you need information, you need to be, coming to, 866 Our Vote hotline and getting that information about your states. But you should be looking at getting your absentee ballot. There are all these kinds of ways that people can be involved. I mean, we are into organizing at the state level with the powerful, amazing grassroots organizations that do this work, that won the Tennessee battle. because they are doing this work. And we are with organizing them at the state level so that we demand these states have the best laws going into the November 3rd election. We're not going to sit back. We're not going to play games. We're about really winning this battle. We believe very strongly that the most powerful thing is our vote. Don't dare sit back at home right now and think you have no power. You have so much power because guess what? The most important thing to getting someone to vote is for them to hear from someone saying you ought to vote. Voter contact systems, we need them. We need to be writing postcards to each other saying, please vote. We need to be calling each other saying, please vote. Telling these people in these 15 states that are scheduled to have elections on June 2nd, who they are, make sure that they are ready if in fact those elections take place to vote. You can give people drives to the polls. You know, the most powerful woman in Alabama during the Doug Jones election was a Black woman who said, I don't have education, I don't have money, but she had a car and she took 100 people to the polls. There's all kinds of ways you can help people to vote, to make sure that they exercise their right to vote. Don't sit back and allow people to think that they can scare us, that they can outthink us by, keeping information private, such as the fact that we've been purged. Let's break all of these barriers. We have calls every month. We have work that we're doing every week. We're going to release tomorrow 2 very powerful PSAs. One is to thank the people of Wisconsin. It's gorgeous. Because we got to take our victories and we got to thank people for doing the hard work. And we're going to also put out a PSA just reminding people of the importance of voting and how you are real heroes when you vote. People get it all backwards. They think, that somehow they can protest by not voting. Honey, all you're doing is just helping, Trump and the others to win. What we need is to activate. What we need is to educate. What we need is to mobilize. That's how we win.
Thank you, Barbara. Well, we've got a little under 10 minutes left, so I want to ask our remaining panelists to both give us what it is that's inspiring you now. It could be what you're working on. It could be what you're drawing people to. It could be the promise of these frameworks. In the morning for you, and you've been so wonderful to join us. I'm going to come to you next.
Hello? Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, it cut out. It just cut out for a minute. It froze. But I think you're asking about possibilities, what's going forward.
Yes.
I think I can be quite pessimistic, and it's going to sound pessimistic at first, but I think kind of embracing the pessimism is quite important. I think what this pandemic has shown is what the stakes are, really. If you look, one of the things that we tend to be comforted from here is the scale of death that happens across the world just routinely. So 22,000 children die per day because of poverty, like just on any normal day. About 9 million people will die from poverty. And so what we're seeing here now is we're actually seeing death is something, our lives is something that is really genuinely on the line on a daily basis, which should make us really understand what the stakes are globally, because that is how most of our people, Black and brown people, live. Really, that's just their condition. And so hopefully that would make us think broader, have a bigger imagination about, and to say, well, actually, how do we fix that problem? Because the global downturn, it's happening now, is going to affect us, but it's going to affect us in the developing world far more and increase that kind of life and death thing. So I think one of the things I would draw on is say, actually, well, this is an opportunity to reach out and to kind of have a global perspective on this and say, well, actually, we really need a new political and economic system. Like this doesn't work. Like we should have known before, but we really, really, really should know now. This doesn't work for us. And so we should definitely do as much as we can to kind of hold our governments to account that we have now. The Black Panther Party talked about survival pending revolution. But we need a revolution. That really is the only solution to this. And hopefully we can see that. We can see that now.
All right, thank you, Kai. Bree, I see you nodding your head, so I feel that you're next.
Yes, I'm definitely in the revolution camp. Just by virtue of the fact that the people who are currently in power are the people who brought us to the disaster, and so logically, those are the people who need to be removed. And the systems that are in place are what brought us to the disaster, which is why those systems are what need to be changed. And in this moment, I'm drawing inspiration, as I always do, from radical reimagining and the spirit of collectivism. You know, I think that this is not the time to talk about what we can't do. This is certainly not the time to talk about what we can't afford, because if, you know, we have trillions of dollars to, you know, keep the financial markets going, then, you know, why can't we afford the things that we know we need, such as housing and healthcare, you know? And then just that spirit of collectivism. I choose to organize at the grassroots community level because I believe that that is the most basic building block of political power. And I think that Barbara was speaking to that and talking about how we really have to continue to mobilize and build in this moment. And that has always really looked like people working with the people that are immediately around them. So I think that the best thing that we can do is to connect with those that are immediately around us in our communities, in our neighborhoods, and imagine together that better world and build it and realize it. And that is what I consider to be the radical, you know, tradition that I am stepping into, that many people are in this moment, and that we have to carry forward. This resistance, obviously, has been going on since the very beginning of colonialism and slavery and all of this forced labor system. And so now it's that time to you know, reimagine where we go from here. This is not only the culmination of the past, this is also a preview of what is to come with disaster, as we, you know, see the further effects of climate change and all of these other things that are tapping out. We really are at the end of the rope on this, and everything has to change.
Thank you, Bree. Jonathan, I'm going to come to you and just preview your comment about where we go from here, with something that you said earlier. There's been an explosion of gun sales as part of this crisis. So we're not the only people who are thinking, you know, revolutionary change, right? And at the same time, you know, there is a sense of possibility. So how do you pull these two disparate pieces together in your thinking? What inspires you in the face of some of the truly troubling things that you've been seeing before this moment and in this moment?
Well, guns could be a whole other topic.
They sure could.
I'll just say it's hard to shoot a virus with a bullet. Really, it really is. You got to be a really good shot. But guns are serving all these other purposes in line with white supremacy that we were talking about before. But I will say, in terms of action items, there are three that I think are important to think about going forward. One is actually counterintuitive, which is, I think it's important to remember that not all white people support what Trump is doing right now. There are a lot of working class white people. I have reached back out to a lot of my interview subjects who are rural libertarian gun owners, and they're appalled by what's happening. It's just that we're living in these echo chambers right now where you're staying home largely and you only see people you know. Then you're on Twitter, you only see people you agree with. We're not exchanging, usually if you go to work or the gym or sports or something like that, you meet all different kinds of people. So point number one is don't assume that any group is monolithic. It's harder to do, but there are ways of reaching out right now that I think are important even across the political aisle, because I think there are alliances to be made when people are desperate like this that are just harder to do because we're all social isolating. So that's point number one. Point number two is I think for people who have really excellent social media skills, there are a lot of people running for office right now who are running from office from their living room. They probably, like me, not very familiar with how to use Zoom or Twitter or Snapchat. And so I think there's a big volunteer need to volunteer for campaigns now that can help people campaign when they can't hold campaign rallies and shake people's hands in the old way. So I think particularly people with social media skills should really be thinking about volunteering for campaigns that they agree with and help shaping this new mode of campaigning politically. And then I think the third point is just, this isn't just about voting, it's actually about testing. Trump is about to possibly murder about 20% of our country if he just opens up the economy without adequate testing, right? The way that we reopen this economy, and even things like voting, is to know what the risk is every time you step outside. And so it shouldn't just be a push to vote, which of course is vital, but it has to be also a push to do testing, which is where he dropped the ball in the beginning, dropped the ball in the middle, dropped the ball now. There's a political reason why they don't want to do testing, but I think we're not going to be safe until we have testing. So as we push for voting and everything else like that, we also have to push for COVID testing to know, to know our risk and to know how we can re-engage with the world again.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Paul Butler. What's inspiring you? What should be inspiring us?
Two things. First, the good and bad news that tens of thousands of people are being released from prison and jail in response to this global health emergency. It's bad news because there are 2.3 million people in prison, and so it's just a fraction. But what we should learn from the fact that tens of thousands of people are coming home and that crime is going down, not up, that this is the kind of decarceration on the way to abolition that we must have. And this is a teachable moment because we have people coming home simply, again, as a response to the pandemic, and we are as safe as we would be if they were locked up. The other thing that inspires me is this conversation with these scholars and activists. And I'm inspired because we're talking about race. It would be easy to make this a conversation about class or poverty or global inequality. And certainly this pandemic is about all of those, but it's also about race. And we have to understand that because, again, with the craftiness and adaptive nature of white supremacy, the language it uses now is color blindness. And people have said, oh, we're all equally affected by this pandemic, but we know that that's not true. And so we also have to talk about race-based solutions. They used to say that when there's a recession for white folks, it's a depression for African Americans. But when there's a depression for white folks, what is there for African Americans and Latinx people and Native people? If the Black unemployment rate is always twice the white unemployment rate, what will it mean for African Americans when the white unemployment rate is 30%? Mm-hmm. President Obama, my favorite president by far, didn't love everything he did. He was once asked what he was going to do about Black unemployment. And he said, well, I can't have a Black unemployment bill. We need a Black unemployment bill. We need race-based remedies. Otherwise, we're going to rebuild this nation the same way that New Orleans got rebuilt after Katrina. Mm. We're going to rebuild it on the backs of Latinx people and the backs of Black people to the benefit of some privileged white people. To the extent that we are now going to rebuild this country, we need to rebuild it from the ground up.
Well, thank you all for such a provocative conversation, so much food for thought. I want to thank all of you for joining us. This would not have been possible without you, and also without the time and effort of our team at the African American Policy Forum and at the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies. And now a very, very special thank you to all of the panelists: Paul Butler, Bree Newsom, Barbara Arnwine, Jonathan Metzel, and Kahindi Andrews. Thank you for helping us think through this crisis. This has been a very inspiring and necessary conversation, and we'd like to urge all of you listening to keep this conversation going with your friends, with your families, within your communities. You can follow the conversation across social media platforms at AA Policy Forum, at our website, aapf.org. We'll continue to provide information, resources, opportunities to galvanize this experience. We want to see it come together into an energy that really can propel us into another universe of possibility. We'll continue to do so through our blog on our website, as well as on our podcast, Intersectionality Matters. It's available on iTunes, Spotify, and SoundCloud. This conversation will be posted in Intersectionality Matters next week. Under the Blacklight continues next Wednesday, featuring David Blight, Ibram Kendi, Kate Mann, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, and Sandy Darity. We're more than excited, and we look forward to you joining us. Now, next week, we'll be looking at the ways this pandemic is a deja vu experience. And we want you to think in the coming days about how does knowing this history, what we've heard here today, what we will hear next week, help us not to repeat it. So we want to hear from you. We want you to tell us what moment in your community's history has echoed the moment that we're seeing now. So share a story, an image, a text, a video, a data point with us on social media at AA Policy Forum. Use the hashtag AAPFCOVID. If you also comment on our podcast, Intersectionality Matters, we would appreciate it. Now we're gonna invite a few people who retweet, who comment on this topic to an exclusive after show discussion with me and some of our panelists. So join the conversation and then join the after the show. Thank you all for joining us. Enjoy your evening. Please stay safe, stay strong as we continue to organize and resist. Good night.